Hello and welcome to ISPP Policy Review podcast. My name is Sagrika Unikrishnan and I am the PR editor at the Policy Review. And our guest for today needs no introduction if I let him say a line right away. We're delighted to bring to you Mr. Amit Verma, who has gladly agreed to be our first guest on the IPR podcast for this academic year. Mr. Verma is a writer and podcaster based in Mumbai. He's been a journalist since 2001 and won the Bastia Prize for Journalism in 2007 and 2015. He teaches online courses in writing and podcasting. So, Amit, over to you.
Thank you. You guys invited me to speak about public policy, and so I prepared a brief slideshow. For those of you who are not watching it on YouTube, who are listening to it through audio, you can go over to YouTube and see the slides. But I'll try to be clear while I kind of go through my points. Now, what I like to do when I think about something is rather than sort of give uh, general gyan in terms of guideline one, guideline two, all of that. I like to take a step back and get a little meta and actually think about the problem, as it were. So go back to first principles and sort of formulate first a guide for myself on how to think about something before I actually think about it. For example, the example that I give during my writing course is that if a young kid goes to learn chess, a good chess coach is not going to make her ratta maro the moves that, d4, d5, c4 is queen's gambit and blah blah blah. Instead, they'll teach them broad principles that you need to occupy the center, space is important, initiative is important, develop your pieces, and so on.
Right.
So similarly with writing, I keep telling people that I don't just want to give a bunch of guidelines like don't use adverbs, don't use cliches, but let's think about why. Let's take that further step back. So I want to do that when it comes to policy as well. And I've prepared like 8 questions. Or 8 things for policy people to think about. Now, catered to young people like yourself who are kind of getting into policy and are enthusiastic about it,
Right.
and the whole idea being that. Um, you might be familiar with all of these. You guys have, in fact, studied policy much more than I have, right? So you'll be familiar with all the basics of policies and so on. But sometimes I feel it's important to kind of take a step back once in a while and think about it and aim for some kind of clarity. So to that effect, I am now going to just share a slideshow. Give me a moment.
Sure.
Right? Can you see this?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I'll minimize our faces so we can see the policy. Yeah. So again, some thoughts on policy. These are meta thoughts. These are just meant to spark thought. These are not words of great gyan or wisdom. I'm sure your teachers at the ISPP have way more experience and insight than I possibly do. But this is like one thing I like to do is again take a step back and get a little meta. So this is my effort to do that. And one second. Yeah. And the first right at the start, I think when you're a young person getting into public policy, you need to be clear about why are you here. Which seems almost basic, but I think that's a starting point. Are you driven by the desire to make the country a better place, for example, or do you feel that your skills are suited to public policy? Have you studied economics perhaps, and this seems one of the logical career paths that you can take? Do you feel that public policy suits your skills and inclinations, and so on? Do you want to rise up the power structure in general, and public policy is a good way to make a great impact on the world? Whatever it is, I think it's important at the start to have clarity about your own motivations. And the reason I say this is that too often, you know when we are thinking public policy, we think of public policy as an interaction between a particular piece of policy, the people it's intended to help, and the whole political economy in between. But the point is that every person working in public policy is also a player herself, in a sense. It helps to have clarity, and also, as I'll elaborate upon a little later, that clarity will help you sort of keep sight of why you are doing what you are doing. So that's question number one to keep in mind. Question number two, very basic, think outcome, not intention. Too many policies are driven by intention, where such and such bad thing is happening in the world. We want to do something about it. Let's have a law that outlaws it. But the intention is noble, you get all your talis, but the outcome may not follow. And again, when I say outcome, I say probable outcome, because we must realize that the world is a complicated place, and uh, we can't control everything. In fact, another slide that I should have included, this should have been 9, is have humility. Take the Don't take the engineering mindset into public policy, what Frederick Hayek calls a fatal conceit, in thinking that you can design society and that the policies that you design can change the world and so on. That's go in there with a certain amount of humility, realizing that you will only at best make difference in the margins, and then speak about outcomes. Like, my show is called The Seen and the Unseen, which is a phrase, the podcast that I do, which is a phrase inspired by this great essay by the French writer Frederick Bastiat, who wrote an essay in the 19th century called That Which Is Seen and That Which Is Not Seen. And in that, he says that all public policy, all actions, in fact, have a seen effect and an unseen effect. Now, for example, let me get concrete and give you an example of, say, any price control, right? Say that uh, there is, for example, take the way the Uber price system works, their sort of dynamic pricing. And so whenever there is a shortage, the government will say that, oh no, rides are getting too expensive, we should regulate it, we should put a price cap, and the intention is good. And what is seen is that a taxi which would otherwise cost 300 rupees now only costs 100 rupees, because there is no surge pricing, right? What is unseen is that there are no taxis at all, because price controls always lead to shortages. It's a first come, first serve. Which is how they are allocated. And secondly, they provide that they prevent information from going down the line to other potential suppliers who it would have incentivized to get into the game. So they have two very dangerous kind of outcomes. One is the proximate outcome of shortages, and the other is the longer term outcome of those shortages persisting, because you're sending the wrong signals out into the marketplace. So we need to think about uh, probable outcomes. And the thing is, even though in the framework of the seen and the unseen, we think of the unseen as unintended consequences. The point is, these consequences may be unintended, but they can be foreseen. And one of the ways in which you can foresee possible outcomes is by thinking about the incentives that they create, because everybody reacts to incentives. And that's something that you should keep your eye on. Question number three, what you need to ask is, can it be done? Whatever policy you are proposing. And this goes to different levels. And one level is just a level of the political economy, that you want to put a policy that shifts an equilibrium, let's say, from A to B. So, who are the people who are benefiting from A? Are they going to fight back? Are they people within the system? Will the system ever do anything against its own interests? And also, the system is not just politicians; it's also bureaucrats. They will often have, differing incentives when it comes to carrying out public policy. And again, the very complicated farm bills that are now going on are sort of an example of this. Where the political economy is complicated. The different players in the game have different incentives, which is why for all of these decades, even though for a long period in time people knew that farm reforms needed to be done, nobody could actually do it. And even now that these bills have been passed, there are all of these other problems to negotiate, which is something I'll come to a couple of slides later. But then the key thing is, when you think about, can it be done? I mean, can it be done in the context of actually getting a policy through, actually getting the state to implement it, bureaucrats and politicians to come together to get it done? And one sort of important way of doing it is considering the incentives of both the players concerned and figuring out a way to frame it. I think people who want reform, especially in a liberal direction towards more freedom, um, often don't think hard enough about how to frame their policies. Like, let's go back to price controls, for example. If something is too expensive, it's very easy for a politician to say we should have farm controls and we should have price controls, sorry. And it's very easy to frame that by saying, look, I'm compassionate, I want everyone to get low prices. That's a very easy framing. It's much harder for the person on the other side to frame it, because you're talking about unseen implications of the policy. So here I'm reminded of a story which I think Arthur Brooks once, the founder of AEI, once related, where he spoke about three guys who go to play golf. I think in his story it was a doctor, a priest, and a libertarian economist. And these three guys find that as they're playing golf, it's very slow because the group in front of them is like taking forever. They're taking 1 hour plus hole, and they're like, what's going on? So they call one of the caddies from the group ahead of them and they say that, boss, what is the problem? Why are you taking so long? And the caddy says, oh, no, no, these three guys who are playing in this group, they're all blind. They are blind firefighters. When there was a fire in the town square last year, they rushed into it and they lost their eyes. And so, so they're taking time to play golf because they are blind. And at this point, the doctor says, oh, I understand. They're such heroes. It's perfectly fine. The priest says, God bless them. God bless them. We will wait. And the libertarian economist says, why don't they play at night? Now, this is a fantastic answer in terms of the analytical aspect of it. It makes sense, but it's a terrible answer in terms of framing, because it seems to lack compassion and empathy and all of those things. And this is, I think, a problem that many people who might feel that their ideas have power and potency, but they make the mistake of not framing it properly. Unfortunately, the side that has won the compassion battle, so to say, that particular battle of optics, is the side whose policies cause tremendous damage, as we've seen over basically all of independent India's history. So the framing is important. And now, here, in terms of framing, you have to think of uh, when you're trying to push a public policy, sell it internally, you have to think of, one, how to frame it to the politician. So you have to frame it to the politician in terms of his incentives. He wants to win elections. He wants to do something that will not lose him votes. You need to frame that policy accordingly. When you go to the bureaucrat, what are the bureaucrat's incentives? Parkinson's law states that a bureaucrat will always try to maximize his power and budgets. So, um, how do you frame it accordingly, keeping their incentives in mind, looking at the world as it is and not as it should be? So this is also something that you need to think about. Point number 5 is anticipate the friction. In terms of, let's say you get a policy through. Now, what is happening in the real world is you might have a terrible policy which you've replaced with a bad policy, but shifting from one equilibrium to another has costs. You could say, I'd call it the transaction costs of a policy shift. And that becomes very difficult. How do you negotiate that? For example, with these farm laws, what you're seeing is that friction, where farmers in large parts of the country think the farm laws are great. Farmers in some parts of the country think that they're horrible, because their interests are affected by it and all of that. Now, it's a very complicated argument to make and to frame for the politician, that these are the unintended consequences that APMCs have had over the years, MSPs have had over the years. All of that might well be true, but the bottom line is that the status quo created certain winners and certain losers, and those winners are always going to fight back. So that's a friction you have to kind of anticipate. You might also, for example, take the policy view that, listen, on a matter of principle, tariffs are bad. We should, whenever you impose tariffs on imports, goods that come from outside, the seen effect is that domestic consumers do better, but the unseen effect, which is far greater, is that consumers suffer, and all of us suffer in the long run, which is philosophically the correct way to think about it. But how do you shift from one equilibrium to the other? The revenue that comes in from such tariffs, are they going to be given up? Won't many of our parties get significant funds from local producers, who are a strong interest group? Are they not going to fight back? How does all of that work out in the real world? And this is something to anticipate, and there are no easy solutions for this. Sometimes change is necessary, it's important, but there will be friction, and rather than be blindsided by it and then lash out, as I see people in this government doing, it's better to sort of anticipate in advance that these kind of pushbacks are inevitable. So how do we tackle it, how do we handle it, all of that. um, Tip number 6 is be self-aware, consider your incentives. And now this is a slightly different point from the first one I made. My first point was more about, when you get into public policy, be clear about why you are doing it. Here I'm saying, once you're already in the system, consider your incentives. Like, if you're a policy person, where are you? If you're in a think tank, what are your incentives? What kind of think tank is it? What do your peers think of you? Do you need to find validation from your peers? If you're in a particular think tank, do you need to always think about where your funding is coming from, and therefore keep their incentives in mind? Just as a concrete example, if you're a think tank taking money from, say, the Nilekani Group, who are considerable philanthropists and do a lot of good, but it also creates a situation that, then can you will you find it so easy to speak out against Aadhaar, the imposition of Aadhaar, rather? So that creates a kind of a conflict, and we can often fool ourselves and rationalize taking positions which are against our principles, but we can rationalize sort of taking those positions for for various reasons, and think of them as necessary compromise. So I won't make a value judgment about how much compromise we should make and where do you cross a line, but always consider your incentives and be clear about what you're doing, and this will bring clarity to your actions. 7 is have a north star. What do I mean by a north star? I mean, um, something that guides you in terms of your actions. Like, as a policy person, one North Star I'd be happy to recommend is Mahatma Gandhi's sort of guiding light, which is that he would think of any action from a point of view of, is it good for the poor? And for a country like India, where getting rid of poverty is our greatest imperative, it's a moral imperative, uh, and it's something that a lot of people who pay lip service to it actually do the opposite. And our politicians have perpetuated poverty over uh, all our existence, with brief exceptions. um, so that's a good guiding light to have. Or your guiding light could be, let's say, I will always put individual liberty at the forefront of what I do, and the autonomy of individuals, and not treat citizens as subjects. That could be a north star. It doesn't matter what your north star is, but it's important to have a north star and to remind yourself of it from time to time, because what often happens in our journey is that politics is, in a certain sense, obviously the art of compromise. And your incentives are such, you have to deal with interest groups, you have to sort of, you're buffeted from all directions, that eventually you lose all principles whatsoever. You might rationalize and say that, no, I have these principles, but to get there I have to do all of this, but you lose it all. And I say politics, but it relates to policy as well, because there is politics everywhere. You will have competing incentives wherever you are. All reform will be difficult and incremental, if at all. So it's important to know why you're sort of doing what you're doing, and also, therefore, it's important to keep moving in the right direction. You will never sort of, if you're working on policy, you will never get the perfect policy that you would like implemented. But what is important is to kind of not go in the opposite direction. Even an inch in the right direction is important. So, for example, when I was editor of Pragati, which was Public Policy magazine, in terms of our opinion pieces, I'd be okay with supporting any piece which either increases individual freedom, or even if the balance between the state and individual remains the same, it it proposes a more efficient way, which is often a market based way, a more efficient way of achieving whatever the desired outcome is. But I would never go in the opposite direction, where something reduces individual freedom and increases the sort of oppression of the state. You don't necessarily have to share the precise same values as I do, but you need to be clear about what your values are, and you need to be clear that there is something somewhere that you should never compromise on. And yeah, and on that note, we can sort of end this presentation, and I'll stop sharing and open myself up to your questions, and maybe ask you a few questions.
Sure, this is great actually. And so one question that struck me when you said this was, have a North Star. And so the way I understand it is having a purpose of sorts on why you're doing it. Now, this is something that I think our generation in particular is really struggling with. So, if I had to ask you that, so have you figured out what your North Star is, and how did you come about like the whole figuring out process?
I think when I think of public policy, my North Star really is, respecting the individual,
Mm.
respecting individual freedom. And as in my in the last talk that I gave to you on consent,
Yeah.
which listeners and viewers can also find on your YouTube channel, I think, I kind of pointed out that that's useful for two reasons. One is I just think that respecting individual autonomy has a moral value in and of itself, and
Hmm.
that's important. And if you want to sort of ignore consent and approve of the coercion of the state, it better be for a bloody good reason. So to the limited extent that the state needs to protect our rights and so on, I'm okay with that. But apart from that, you just need to ask tough questions and recognize that there is a moral cost. The other aspect of it beyond the moral aspect is just the aspect that, people don't realize that this is a positive sum world. Whenever two people interact in any way, whenever there is a voluntary transaction, both people benefit. It's a positive sum world. That's how we progress. We can solve each other's problems if no one gets in the way. And unfortunately, the state is always getting in the way for the best intentions. So uh, so the consequences of getting in the way of these voluntary interactions is terrible. It's terrible in a moral sense because you're stopping individuals from transacting with each other as they would wish. Where the right will do it in the context of personal freedoms, and they will interfere with what you can do in your bedroom, and the left will do it with also with personal freedoms, and they will interfere with what you can do in the marketplace. And both of them are wrong, both of them are morally wrong, and both of them have bad consequences, because what is unseen is the benefit that both people who were prevented from transacting would otherwise have had. So my North Star per se is individual freedom from either of these points of view. You may say that, hey, utilitarianism doesn't matter, but fine, then in that case, to use jargon in deontological terms, what is your core moral first principle then? And we can sort of proceed from there. Or you can say that this moral stuff is all humbug. I just want something which gets me the best consequences. And there again, freedom will get you the best consequences. And the challenge there, of course, is that what is voluntary exchange? Part of how voluntary exchanges and these positive sum interactions manifest themselves are through markets. Unfortunately, in India, we are in a position where markets get such a bad rap because we are surrounded by crony capitalism, where cronies get away with so much, hand in hand with the oppressive power of the state. And we seem to think that's markets. But what we must, I think, realize and keep driving home is that the interests of big business are completely opposite to that of the people at large. That what is pro business is never pro market. A business will always want special favors from the state, and they'll want uh, you know their position in the marketplace protected. Whereas ideally, what all of us should want is that no one is protected. The coercive power of the state is just upholding the rule of law and not favoring one player over the other, not creating entry barriers for new entrants. And in that kind of an atmosphere of voluntary interaction, society will, uh, uh, flourish. That's again a narrative challenge that those of us who feel this way face in India. What is your North Star?
No, I was actually thinking about that right now because I think for me, so I worked as a Gandhi Fellow for 2 years. And at that point, I realized that I like working with children. So I think that is, in a way, my North Star, making the lives of children better. But I don't know how to go there. And now, like you said, we should know that it can be done, and how do you do it? So I'm still like trying to figure that out. Which actually brings me to the next question, which while you were talking and on state's role and how it functions in a marketplace. Now, the farm bills are one place where the state is withdrawing from the marketplace that it had sort of created, and there now we see a whole lot of interest groups. There is so much protest going on and so on. So, what is your take on farm bills? Like, where do you see
Yeah,
the
it's
problem there? Sorry.
yeah. No, it's very complicated. So the point is it's so complicated, and I can argue it from both sides, and it's so nuanced. So
Hmm.
I I I think broadly they are a step in the right direction. I don't like the way that they were pushed through Parliament. I also think that I'd like to see a little more federalism, where many of these decisions are being made at the local level by the local players. I haven't studied the farm bills in detail, but I'm sure that there'll be nuances I will disagree with, the nuances I will agree with. But I think that they are a step in the right direction because the farmers. One of the reasons agriculture has suffered, and even though the rest of the much of some of the rest of the economy was freed up in 91 and flourished as a result, farming wasn't. And the reason farmers have suffered is that there is lack of choice. Now, the I had an episode with the farmer leader Gunwant Patil of the Shetkari Sangatana couple of years ago, episode 86. It was my only episode in Hindi, and there he shared with me a poem by the farmer leader Sharad Joshi of the Shetkari Sangatana, where let me see if I can remember that, where Mr. Joshi basically said ki, and this is like a farmer talking to a consumer,
All right.
and the farmer is saying, मरते हम भी हैं मरते तुम भी हो, मरते हम भी हैं मरते तुम भी हो, हम सस्ता बेच के मरते हैं तुम महंगा खरीद के मरते हो, which is basically pointing out the monopoly role of the APMC, where the government created the APMC, which is the only place. It's a state-created monopoly, which is the only place you can sell your wares. And what Mr. Patil pointed out was that you could have a situation where the farmer is selling something for 2 rupees and the consumer is buying it for 20 rupees. Whereas if you allowed competition among middlemen are not bad, but if you allow competition among them and you don't have a government mandated middleman, then the farmer could sell for 10 rupees and the consumer could buy for 12 rupees, and both of them would benefit by 8 rupees each, right?
Hmm.
And so that was one of the sort of structural problems that was kind of there. And is giving the farmer more choice a good thing? It definitely is. Now it is being framed by people who oppose the farm bills as, oh, immediate corporatization of interests, and uh, Adani will benefit and blah blah blah, and I'm not sure you can really get from here to there so smoothly and so easily. But the other thing is, and this is again a point I make, that you have to anticipate this friction. You have to realize that there are people, and obviously the next step of this, it could be doing something about MSPs. I don't think MSPs are mentioned in the farm bills, and that's one of the things that the farmers are fighting about.
Right.
Again, I'm but but the issue is that the next logical step is handling the MSPs, and the MSPs have created distortions in markets, and in the long run have harmed farmers. But this is unintuitive, and many farmer movements get this. The Shetkari Sangatana gets this. Many farmer movements get this. Sharad Joshi ji famously got this when he used to talk about how the biggest problem in agriculture was the iron hand of the state. But the point is that there is, I think, an importance for process as well. And
Hmm.
you cannot simply say that in a democracy you should just push something through, willy nilly, kind of in the way that it was done. And the point is, you can make the argument that, yeah, we'll never get good reforms done if we don't push them through like this. But then once you set the precedent, you can also push bad reforms through like this. uh, and that's a road to totalitarianism. So that's again something to keep in mind. And obviously all the vested interests are fighting back. If you've been given an entitlement, you're not going to give it up, right? And I don't really want to get too much into the normative aspect of it. I think the farm bills are a step in the right direction, but I can also argue the other way and talk about the way that they are done, and talk about federalism, and find various other things wrong with it, and find various tweaks that one could make within the farm bills to make them politically palatable. But that's not the point. The larger lesson here is that it's not enough to get a reform that you think is good through. You also have to anticipate the friction that it will cause, especially in a democracy like ours, where there kind of will be a lot of pushback, which is not an argument to do anything, but it's an argument to act in a clear-headed way while being completely aware of what could transpire.
Right. So what I understand is you're saying the means are as important as the end in itself, and
The means are more important. The means are more important because, see, the ends will keep changing,
hmm,
right? The ends can keep changing, but the means are more important because ultimately the means are your greatest protection against totalitarianism and against oppression. Again, I'll hark back to the talk I gave you guys about consent and coercion, which is, so for me, that's incredibly important. Now, if
hmm,
in a democracy you have certain processes and ways of uh, doing things, I think that's important. I think it's easy to say that, listen, these reforms are good, we need to get them through somehow, use the iron hand and all of that. And and I see the seductive logic in that, but it's also dangerous to kind of get carried away with it. And I think in the long run also, and this is not a challenge that people in public policy can do something about themselves, but I think in the long run, what you need to do is you need to change the view of society on a particular issue, which then makes a change easy. And therefore I think all true change has to come from the bottom up. And if you do it from the top down, it might be unsustainable at certain levels. Now, and I think we've seen that. I think our founders in that sense made a mistake by taking a top down direction to the economy, and that eventually got undone. But over the years we've seen that top down attempts to at social engineering don't work at all. I think if you want to change society, you have to change it from the bottom up. Again, you've been a Gandhi scholar, you said, and this was something Gandhi believed in,
right.
that change will come from within society and not from the state. And it's dangerous to use the coercive hand of the state too much. In this case, I think really, most farmers would not have an issue with more choice. I
Hmm,
think there is a reason that the movement against the farm bills is concentrated in specific areas, where there are people who've benefited for decades from these kind of entitlements of the MSPs, and to whom the sort of the effects of the power of choice would be unseen because they've never seen it. So they've benefited from the system as it is, and they want to cling on to that, and that's rational and understandable. It's not that their fight is necessarily unjust, except that, when I look at public policy, the question that I always ask is, where is the coercion?
hmm,
So when you have any kinds of entitlements, the coercion is obviously on the citizen, because the citizen is paying for that,
right.
and is coerced to pay for that rather than paying for that of her own free will. So anyway, so that's a bit of a ramble, and my point here is not so much to talk about my own sort of policy or philosophical preferences, but just to sort of articulate how one can think about these things and get clarity with what one thinks about one's own role in it.
Right. So actually, this brings me like this makes reminds me of something that we've been discussing in our business and government class, which was about how individuals are individually rational but collectively irrational. And this we've seen it play out across domains and spaces. So in such a case, the whole iron hand approach of policy making does make sense on some level, right? Because you try and you want something good to be passed, and you know that maybe collectively this might not work out as much as if I push it individually. So do you do you always think that it might lead to a bad problem, or like you said, eventually it will lead to a very different system of government altogether?
No, I mean, in the sense that I am all for, like I said in my last slide, for moving policy in the right direction.
Hmm.
Right, and you've got to and the issue here of means is really of how they got it through parliament
Right.
in the instance of the farm bills. But I'm always for moving in the direction of this thing. And you'll never have a consensus on anything. So if you have a policy that is a problem that is coercive and you make it less coercive, I think that's a good thing. To take another example that is slightly less fraught and is easier to talk about at the current moment, I'll pick something like, say, restrictions on FDI in retail, right? So local retailers will obviously form an interest group and go to the government and say that don't allow FDI in retail. And those kind of small retailers are significant funders of parties like the BJP and the Aam Aadmi Party. So of course they will oppose FDI in retail, though the BJP has articulated different positions on that in different points in time. And the issue is that, let's say, as a policy maker, you realize that we should not have FDI in retail, that it harms a consumer, that it seems to have the seen effect of helping local producers, but it actually harms the consumers because instead of paying 10 rupees for something, they are paying 12 rupees. That 2 rupees is the unseen effect. It would have gone back into the economy, created more jobs, plus local producers who would be forced to compete with with the whole world would have lifted their game as well, and that would have helped and all of that. So you can take that kind of approach and say that, okay, this is a coercive policy with these sort of bad um, outcomes, so let's change it, and you bring that about. So in a case like that, I would say, even though the vested interests would fight back,
Hmm.
you got to do what you got to do. You're moving in the right direction, and that really doesn't require parliamentary approval or whatever. um, uh, but I think that at s- the sort of approach that I see from many people close to the dispensation is that we have the numbers now. Let's do whatever. Now, those could include, going in the right direction with policies like, say, reducing FDI on retail. If they, as a completely hypothetical example, I don't even know their current stand on this. I know they were against it in 2014. Um, or it could go in a direction of, let's change the constitution. Why do we need so much liberalism? Let's make it a Hindu constitution or whatever. I'm not saying that will happen. That's an extreme situation and is actually a caricaturing of their position. But the point is, it could go in a direction that you don't want it to uh, go in as well. That said, if it's a democracy, if they have the numbers in parliament, that's fine. But nevertheless, the way certain bills are passed through and what the procedures are is something that's important to consider. And in and in this particular case, they were just kind of I think blindsided by the opposition, and they could have anticipated it better and sort of done something about that. So the farm bills are extremely complicated, and I don't know why we came back to that, but yeah. Carry
All right. So actually, so the theme for our this issue is called reflecting on 2020 from a public policy lens. And so this is one question I thought we could like get your take on as to what do you think was one policy that was really good that was passed in 2020 and one that wasn't so much.
Okay, this is a good question. The thing is that I could have, you know, when I think of what the Modi government has done, and I presume you mean this in the context of the India,
Mm,
I could, in the past, over the past 5 years, I could go back and say that, okay, the bankruptcy code was good, but demonetization was a disaster, the largest assault on property rights in human history. As I keep saying so often, it's become a cliche. uh, GST was a good idea but horrendous implementation. And in fact, again, it's a classic example of the seen and the unseen being the unseen effects being foreseeable, because I did foresee it. I did an episode of the seen and the unseen before GST was passed, pointing out where my guest and I pointed out everything that would go wrong with it, and all of those things did go wrong with it, right?
mm,
So they were all foreseeable from before that this is just stupid, and yet the government went ahead and did that. As far as 2020 is concerned, I it's kind of hard to say. I am glad that movement has been made in terms of doing something about our labor and agriculture problems. Whether they have been done in the right way and the devil is in the details. um, um, One doesn't really know. Like, GST was a movement in the right direction, but they botched it completely. So the devil there is in the details, and I find that many who defend the labor laws are defending them on the basis of intention and not outcome. That the intention is to protect labor, but what they do is actually deprive them of opportunity and jobs down the line. Many of the people who oppose them, in fact, much to my amusement, were people who for years have been saying we need exactly these reforms, but just because of the government that goes for it, they kind of oppose it, which is kind of one of the sad things that happens, which is why, as a policy person, you should always also consider your own incentives and separate the politics from the policy. That sometimes you might have strong political feelings against particular politicians, and I do, and I'm against this dispensation, as everybody knows, though I'm also against the people who oppose them in opposition, because they're all scoundrels. But you have to separate that from the way that you think about policy and what you do. But to sort of after rambling, to get back to the specific question you asked, I'd say that this year I can't think pick anything as good or bad, but I think a classic policy dilemma that comes up and that is instructive for everyone who is thinking about state action is a lockdown. And
correct.
I've had a bunch of episodes on the lockdown. And the thing is, it's also a classic illustration of the seen and the unseen, where the policymaker's dilemma is that, look, you can choose to have a lockdown or not have a lockdown. And of course, there can be gradations in between. But for the moment, if you imagine that the choice is between lockdown and no lockdown, the point is that the costs of that will be seen and the benefits of that will be unseen. The costs of that will be seen because if you have a lockdown, the economy will suffer and people will die, and you will have a humanitarian crisis like we did. The benefit of that is that people would otherwise have died who are still alive, and you don't see that, right? And the other way around, if you didn't have a lockdown, you would have seen a certain death toll, and you would have known that some proportion of that could have been solved if there had been a lockdown. But at the same time, what you will not see is the benefit that you've got by avoiding the economic damage and the deaths down the line. And the point is that there are no definitive answers in that calculus. 10 years later, you can look at the numbers and you'll understand the science of the virus a little better and all of that, and you'll be able to say that that was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. And in that sense, that could be the answer to both your questions depending on where you're coming from. But the policymaker's dilemma is that in the moment, you don't know what's going to happen, and all these various different things can happen, and you have to make difficult choices to the best of your ability with the information given to you. And I think that in modern times, with our politics becoming so shrill and polarized, I think that the policymaker will always face brickbats no matter whatever they do, especially if it is a visible policy. And therefore, it would help to have a North Star guiding you where you say that these are the principles that I am going by, and I'll stick to them, whether it is, Gandhi's principle of caring for the poor, or what could, in fact, be your principle from what you say about doing what is good for the children, because what is good for the children of India today is good for India tomorrow. So, that's a that's a that's an excellent sort of focus to have as well.
Alright. And so Amit, like here I have something that I think I've been struggling with for quite some time now, because, like you said, the unintended consequences of a policy are not unforeseen, right? Even as policy students, we sometimes are able to critique a policy well enough to know that these are the consequences that we can see. But why do you think policymakers, who we've given so much power, responsibility, power and responsibility actually, why are they not like looking at policy in that way? Is there a gap there in terms of our understanding of their understanding, or do you think that they just don't care enough to actually put in so much thought?
It's what you went back to earlier. It's not that there are bad people, there are just
Yeah.
bad incentives. So it could be the case that, like, if you're a bureaucrat, what are your incentives, right? If you think about that, if you're a politician, what are your incentives? In fact, if you're a politician, your incentives are clear. Your incentives are, one, tailored towards votes. There is a political marketplace. The
Yeah.
supply end will cater to what the demand end is expressing, right?
Right.
So, if the people don't want a specific kind of reform, and many of the reforms that we will advocate will seem counterintuitive with the, you know and all of that, then the politicians won't listen. Secondly, their incentives are also tailored towards continuing in power, for which they need money, and the money will come from special interest groups, and there will always be quid pro quos, stated or otherwise. So if you're getting your election money from small retailers who are saying that, this FDI is really hurting us, yaar, then you don't think of it as a quid pro quo. You say that, no, these are my people, I have to look after their interests, we are a democracy. And you go down that line. So those are the incentives of politicians. In the bureaucracy also, what happens is that it depends on, we often form our ideologies when young,
Hmm.
and at some point in time they harden and they become dogma, and then we are simply not open to change. And one of the sort of dogmas that is certainly prevalent, not just among Indian policymakers, but I think Indians at large, and certainly Indians of a certain generation, is that the state has to solve all our problems. And once you sort of have that mindset, then when a policymaker goes to you and says, sir, nahi, state ko nikalna chahiye, the state should not be part of this, you need less of the oppressive hand of the state, then instinctively it doesn't make sense to them. So it is not that they are stupid, it is not that they are bad, it is just the circumstances. We are all creatures of circumstances, in our past, and we are responding to incentives in the present, and all of these make it very hard, and all of these make it a long game. So what you guys should then aim to do is that replace them over the next 20-30 years, and get into those positions yourself, and keep asking yourself tough questions throughout this period, examining your own incentives, making sure that your core principles are not corrupted and compromised, to the extent that you don't really believe in anything anymore. And that happens as one moves through public life. And the thing is, when you're young, you're idealistic, then you become jaded, and you're just kind of going through and you'll rationalize it through that entire process. When you change as a human being, you'll rationalize it all the way and say that, no, these are necessary compromises, and no, this is a move in the right direction, it'll help some people, right? And then you look at the winners of whatever you're proposing. So I think self awareness is kind of key, because yeah, I mean, that's how it
Alright.
is.
And so, in one of our classes, in political conditions of policy reform, we had discuss this battle between ideas, institutions, and interest groups. And so we discussed this over a period of 10 classes, and we never really came to a conclusion, so to speak. We still, at the end of it, we were like, okay, all of these are important, and they have their own specific role to play. But if I had to ask for your opinion on this, who amongst the three, what do you think has probably the biggest influence on policy making?
I think they're all important. I mean, I think they're all important, and I think I'd sort of if you're looking for I words, I'd put incentives at the top, because everybody is sort of responding to incentives. So, and the interest group of retailers, by the way, who doesn't want FDI, they're not bad people either, right?
Right.
They are doing the rational thing to look after their own livelihood. So I think your problem therefore becomes that in this very complex landscape where the incentives aligned against are aligned in various ways towards the coercive hand of the state being used, and the suppression of the autonomy of citizens, as it were. I am sounding so much like an old ideologue here, but so how do we navigate that? And that's a difficult kind of question. I mean, you guys have obviously given much more thought to that specific question if you've done like 10 sessions on it. I'd say institutions are incredibly important, but the design of institutions is also incredibly important. And that if an institution is designed wrongly, it can sort of it can corrode and not fulfill its purpose. And the counter argument to that, which I have received from friends, is that listen, even if you design it properly, it'll be subverted anyway because it'll still be run by individuals who are responding to incentives. So I think that this is there's no easy way out from a situation where you don't have you have this problem to where you don't have this problem. The thing is, we will always have this problem. It's what Thomas Jefferson said about how we need eternal vigilance to safeguard our liberties. So I think that is one of the tasks of the policymaker, I would hope as well, that kind of eternal vigilance where at the very least you avoid a drift towards a totalitarian world.
Right. Okay. And so I think I'll come to my last question for today, which is that you have a very busy schedule. I mean, you're recording, you're speaking at so many events, and you also spoke to us just last month. So, but in the middle of it, you managed to like read up so much about things that are happening around us. And how do you find time? Like, is this because you're interested in the topic? Because that's something that we are struggling with a very packed schedule and with readings for classes and so on. So I think all of us would probably benefit from how you structure to make sure that you're up to date with policy and the happenings of the world.
No, this is something I actually struggle with. I don't use my time as efficiently as I should, and nor do I work as hard as I should. Like people keep saying, do an episode on the farm bills, and one of the reasons I haven't is that I'm still not completely clear about it myself, about where I stand. Like I said, at this moment, I could easily make arguments both for and against it, but I haven't studied it in the kind of detail where I feel confident enough to do an episode on it. And also, we live in such fraught times that even my choice of guest would be people on one side or the other would come down hard on it, and
Right.
all of that. So how do you kind of go for nuance? And nuance becomes like, in a sense, my podcast is the one space where nuance is possible, because trolls on social media don't have the patience to
Listen.
listen to 3-hour podcasts. So in that sense, the audience is kind of self-selected of people who will appreciate something like that. So
Right.
maybe at some point I should do an episode, but when it comes to the seen and the unseen, or what I write, I don't want to do half baked things. In fact, I worry that some of the things I've said earlier in this episode about the farm bills can be sort of twisted to make it sound a particular way. But but to get back to your question of knowledge management, these days I found it very useful to use a tool called Rome Research, uh, where ROAM research, which is a great way of taking notes. They allow not just for nested notes, but they allow for sort of bidirectional linking, where in fact, for the benefit of your viewers, you want me to share my screen and show you what that looks like?
Sure, sure.
Okay, I'll just share this because I find this an enormously inspiring kind of app. So I'd done an episode with the brilliant journalist Rukmini S on data journalism.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of how I took the notes for it, in the sense that, one, I like to start my podcast by talking about the person and their individual journey, because I feel that gets them to relax and it's easier to kind of get a conversational flow going. So so this is what I mean by sort of everything is nested, so you can
Mm-hmm.
categorize everything and you can just put all the info and have all of this uh, kind of here like this. And I had a bunch of general questions about data journalism, and even here they are kind of nested, where I can have further whatever things like one question I wanted to ask is, what about India do journalists not understand? And as a reference for myself, I wrote something that took a note on something that she had said earlier. I had some questions on the political economy, but more than that, she has this amazing daily podcast on COVID, which she's been doing since this crisis began. So, bunch of questions on that, and what are the big questions, for example? So here again, I've nested that here, I've bolded that so I can see that, listed them out episode wise. So when I spoke about the politics of it, the left-right binaries and all of that, then that again opens up here where I'm looking at aspects of it which she's discussed in various episodes, or in each episode she asks a question. So I've got yeah, so I kind of note down a bunch of these questions and all of that. So I find that this is much more organized than, say, Microsoft Word, because earlier I would do it in Word and it would just kind of be one big list, where if she refers to, say, something that I know comes like, I have a 20-page Word document and it comes on page 17 or 18, then I'm scrolling down frantically looking for key, this thing. And what I forgot to show you about Rome is a bidirectional linking, which is basically like, for example, if somebody says something, I can just put double brackets and quote besides it, and that becomes a hyperlink to a page called quotes, where all the quotes that I have similarly shared like that appear. So eventually, and it maps every word and every piece. So, for example, at some point, I'm going to put all the transcripts of my show on there. So now every time that I have asked someone, every time I've used the word incentives, for example, I can get a visual representation of that. I can get a map of that, and I can just see that across episodes and all of that. But Rome is paid. But the point is that people used like Notion is a good tool, which also is a great tool for sort of personal productivity, and they also, I think, allow nested lists and so on. So I think this is something that you should think about consciously, because you guys are actually navigating a lot of knowledge, and most of this knowledge just goes over us. It kind of, it comes and it goes, and a lot of it will inform the way we think about the world, but it's not there, it's not kind of accessible, which is why Tiago Forte came up with this concept of what he calls a second brain, that our brain is not designed to accumulate knowledge. Our brain is designed to come up with creative solutions and think in different kinds of lateral ways, and take in information but not store it. So the notion that therefore is that you also need to build what he calls a second brain using technology, where you can store knowledge and think about it. And I just did an episode which releases the day after we record this, with Krish Ashok, where he spoke about the pyramid of learning, where there is something called a learning pyramid, and if you read, you digest only 10%. If you if you actually watch it or see a demo, you digest more and more. And the maximum way of actually absorbing the knowledge that you get from something is by teaching it. So maybe that is an exercise that you could actually try out, where if you were to create a PowerPoint on something that you've just read, or a series of courses that you've done, and try to teach it to someone in turn, that would force you to, because you then have to explain in a simple way to someone who doesn't know the subject. So that would force you to go deep into that subject and kind of think about it. Like you spoke about those 10 sessions that you did on ideas, institutions, and uh, um, interest groups. So if you had to teach it, how would you teach it? What kind of a PowerPoint would you make? What kind of a document would you make? What kind of an a primer would you write? And thinking along those lines, you will often find clarifies your own thinking. And I again hark back to what George Orwell once said, where he spoke about clear writing and clear thinking being related. And it's not um, uh, it's not a one-way relationship. That people think that, of course, if you're a clear thinker, you will write clearly, which is of course true. But also, if you force yourself to write clearly about a subject, then you will have to think clearly about it, because it's very easy to use obfuscatory jargon and vague abstract terms and write about something. But when you actually have to get concrete and explain something from first principles, and give concrete examples in the real world of whatever you're talking about, you're forced to think that much deeper about it, and you will end up understanding the subject much better. So, what are the mechanisms we build for ourselves where we can do this? Is a question I'm still struggling with. I get this question a lot, and it seems to people on the outside that I get a lot done. I get very little done. Most of my time in front of the computer is like playing online chess or just watching like 600 YouTube videos as I go down a rabbit hole. So I'm not at all that productive. I think but but it is possible to train oneself to be productive. And also, the other key I found with myself is that even if, let's say, you are in front of the computer for 6 hours, and for 4 hours you're actually not doing what you would call work, you are doing other stuff, you're going down all these other areas, you can still maximize what you do in those 2 hours.
Yes.
So I think at some level it's also a question of getting realistic, and sort of figuring out those kind of methods of working, that when you are working you are productive. And I think it's unrealistic to expect anyone to actually do something productive 100% of the time in front of the computer. It doesn't happen with me. I don't know if it happens with any of you. But the little time that you work, how do you work, how do you process knowledge and all of that? And in a sense, by having a weekly podcast that is a deep dive, and that I often have to read many books for each episode, I've forced myself to do that. I've kind of given myself that kind of incentive to do that. So I think those kind of commitment devices also can be useful.
Right. Okay. That's actually great advice. I think all of us would immensely benefit by some, mechanism where we can store notes. Because, like you said, we are consuming a lot of knowledge in a very short span of time. So, yes. Well, Amit, thank you so much. You've given us a lot of time, a lot to think about, and hopefully, we'll see you again on the IPR podcast. I hope you had fun. I had a lot of fun listening to you.
No, I enjoy talking to you every time, because this is not a jaded generation that is kind of going through the motions. So I sincerely hope that I can manage to survive for another 20-30 years, so I can see you guys bringing some actual change into our ravaged country, as it were. So good luck.
Thank you so much. Thank you.